I'm just checking something. All right. Well, anyway, welcome back, folks. Howdy, howdy. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. Well, we're going to continue with Unit 3. We're going to go into Chapter 3 of Unit 3. Yes, we're on Chapter 3. And we're going to look at kind of political and social changes in Europe in the early modern period. We're going to specifically look at this theme of government, especially towards the end of our presentation. That'll work on the screen. What was, I should say, what has been the primary economic focus of Europe during the Middle Ages? It's agriculture and serfdom and manorialism. Anyway, Chapter 3. All right, so what are some political and economic changes in Europe in the period between 1450 and 1750? And we're on a new topic, actually. So let's look at what that lesson objective is. Well, the lesson objective is one of the big themes of Unit 3. How do rulers use a variety of methods to legitimize and consolidate their power? So today we're going to look at Europe, but in our next two chapters, we're going to look at the Islamic world. We're going to look at the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids. And then we'll finally conclude by looking at Eastern Europe with Russia. All right, so let's keep going. So we're going to first look at some economic and social changes going on during the early modern era. And the early modern era is this period of European and world history, world history, in which we are going to see a profound change from the immediate post-classical period. All right, so let's look at the early modern era and kind of what is going on economically in Europe, and then we'll look at some social developments. Well, the early modern period in general, it is going to be this time of increased participation by Europe in international trade. We are going to see as well new hierarchies emerge because of this trade in Europe. And the early modern period is basically going to lead us on a path towards Europe's increased involvement outside of Europe in North and South America, as we'll explore more in Unit 4, in India, as we'll also explore a bit more in Unit 4, and obviously more in Unit 6, and in other places around the world. So let's look at the economics of the early modern era. Because the early modern era is a period of change in which we are going to see the kind of formation of a more commercial society in Western Europe. We are going to see the commercialization of Europe during the commercial revolution. So maybe in the back of your head, draw some comparisons with the commercialization under the Song dynasty in China. So what is the commercial revolution? Well, it is a period in European history in which we are going to see a rapid change in the European economy. We are moving away from a society based on decentralized agricultural production and one towards kind of more modern ideas of trade and manufacturing, even. We are going to see kind of that this is a time period in which the economy of Europe is slowly transitioning to be one more focused on trade and, towards the end of this period, manufacturing. And I do mention that we will have kind of early manufacturing during this commercial revolution, and that is actually true. However, it isn't going to be this factory system. Factories do not exist prior to 1750. But what does exist is this cottage industry idea. Essentially, a cottage industry is where there are multiple parts of a product, and each individual part is made in a separate cottage, a separate home. So, for example, let's take textiles. So, perhaps one family, one household, they will spin the wool into cloth. They will spin the wool into thread. And then another family, they'll take the thread and then they'll weave it. And then another family, they take the thread and they dye it red, for example. So the cottage industry, or kind of the piecemeal industry, or the domestic system, as it's sometimes called, it is going to be this system in which individual parts of the manufacturing product or project are done in different households. So right now, there's no factory system, but this is kind of our example of early modern manufacturing. We do largely see that it is broken up into different households, and that this is largely going to be kind of how these products are made, at least in Europe. But what's causing the commercial revolution? Well, let's take a look at a few. For one thing, we are going to see that all of this increased trade is leading to a new merchant class. And this merchant class is going to greatly expand during the commercial revolution, and they are going to promote its further continuity. And this merchant class is going to be largely defined by a term you might have heard of, but not completely understood, and that is the bourgeoisie. And what is the bourgeoisie in the early modern context? Well, the bourgeoisie essentially are wealthy town dwellers. These are people who essentially control places of manufacturing. They're involved in finance, they're involved in trade, they're involved in the stock market. They're getting their money not through farming, not through being nobles, but through participating indirectly or directly in trade. So the bourgeoisie, or the kind of middle class, you could say. The upper class is the nobility, the middle class, the bourgeoisie. Below them are peasants and urban workers. They are going to be the primary class that will develop during this time and largely direct these developments. But how is Europe getting the money for all of this? How is Europe getting the money for all of this commercialization? Well, it's mostly going to be because Europe is heavily involved in overseas trade, not just in the Indian Ocean, but in the New World as well. As we'll discuss more in Unit 4, Europe has colonies in North and South America. They have colonies in the New World, colonies which provide raw materials that go back to the mother country, that go back to Europe. Also, these colonies have gold. And what do banks need? Banks need gold to back up their currency. So we do kind of see that the colonization of the New World will lead to a tremendous kind of gain in resources and gold to sponsor commercialization. We also see that the governments of Europe are going to heavily promote commercialization, and that's mostly kind of a way to demonstrate their power is by having a strong economy. And it's largely going to be seen through the economic system known as mercantilism. We'll discuss mercantilism in more detail in Unit 4, but essentially what it is going to be this idea of maintaining a favorable trade balance between the colonies that a country has and the mother country. So essentially, we see that there are tight restrictions on trade to make sure it's only going to the European countries. So, for instance, Spain is a country that practiced mercantilism, and we saw that in its creation of their colonies in North and South America. Hey, I'm a Spanish colonist. Who can I trade with for all these raw materials for stuff I need, like manufactured stuff? Well, we largely do see that places like Spain, they're going to say to their colonies, hey, guess what? You can only send your raw materials to us. And in a sense, that's what mercantilism is. It's the idea of maximizing imports, minimizing exports, and making sure that the colonies are giving everything they produce to the mother country. But we also see that there is going to be a lot of state-sponsored corporations. We will talk about the Dutch East India Company, for example. We will talk about the English, or I should say the East India Company in England. But we also see government kind of sponsorship of infrastructure, building roads, building canals, building dams, building things required to produce more goods. And navies to protect these overseas trade. But another cause of the commercial revolution is also the Protestant Reformation. And how is that? Well, to understand that, we first got to go back to the Protestant Reformation. Because the Protestant Reformation opened the doors for individual interpretation of the Bible. And it also opened the doors for that idea of predestination in Calvinist circles, that idea that you're going to go to heaven or hell no matter what. and that's based on birth. But how do you prove if you're going to go to heaven or hell? Well, you got to do the things that God has given you the talent to do. So, in order to prove that you're saved, you need to do things that you're good at, basically. And what if you're good at making a lot of money? Well, if you make a lot of money, God really likes you, basically. And the Protestant work ethic is this notion, kind of that in order to prove my salvation, I've got to do, in order to prove salvation to myself, I should say, I've got to make a lot of money, basically. So we do kind of see that this spirit will encourage merchant activity, especially and primarily in Protestant countries like England and the Netherlands. But what's the result of the commercial revolution? Well, for one thing, we are going to see that to support all of this increased trade, we're going to have more economic institutions like insurance companies, like banking institutions, etc. Stock markets will emerge at this time, and very much related to that idea of a stock market is joint stock companies. So what is a joint stock company? Well, a joint stock company is going to be a company in which we have a lot of government support. A government approves a charter or a formal kind of approval of a company, and that company can kind of open up its doors for private individuals to buy a piece of that company in exchange for the profits of that company. So it's going to kind of open up the risk of starting major companies. We are going to see that private individuals, they can put in money in exchange for owning that company and taking some of its profits. So then we do see that this will largely coincide with the colonization of the New World. Some examples of the joint stock companies that emerged during this time are the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company. It's a related corporation. It's basically owned by the government, but we have private individuals who direct the administration of it and partially own it in the stock market. The stock market's where you buy the stock. The joint stock company is the thing you buy stock in, basically. And we'll discuss what capitalism is more later, but the commercial revolution is instrumental in setting up that economic institution of capitalism. The idea that private individuals own places, workplaces, or the means of production, and then sell their product at a profit in the free market. That is what capitalism is, basically. And it's more complicated than that, and we'll discuss that more later. All you would need to know now is that a result of the commercial revolution is capitalism. Related to that, though, is the increase in demand of goods. We do see that with the kind of building of merchant companies, with the building of joint stock trading companies, we are going to see a lot more demand for goods from outside of Europe. And this demand is going to require access to the supply. So we will see kind of increased European participation overseas trade in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. We will discuss the European presence in the Atlantic Ocean more in Unit 4, and the European presence in the Indian Ocean a bit more in this unit, but a lot more in Unit 4 as well. But because we have this increased prominence of the bourgeoisie, of the merchant middle class, we are going to see that they have a lot of social, economic, and eventually political sway. They are going to be groups of people who will want the governments of their societies to make policy that is beneficial to them. So we will see kind of an increased importance of the bourgeoisie, and that's kind of related to a general theme in world history during the period that we're discussing now, between 1450 and 1750, is that trade is leading to new groups of elites, in this case, merchant elites, or the bourgeoisie. Finally, let's end this section by looking at the social changes during the early modern period. Well, for one thing, we are going to see that this is really the time period when serfdom is at its rapid decline. We will see serfdom linger on, unfortunately, until the French Revolution, but we do see a steady transition away from serfdom. And we already saw kind of the origins of that with the Black Death, but it's going to greatly increase during this time period. We do see that the decline of serfdom will lead to increased wage labor. And we call wage labor free labor, not because that the workers are not getting paid, but because the workers have a lot more say in who is their employer, unlike with serfdom. That's not to say that everyone is completely free during this time. We still have unfree labor systems, for example, slavery, as we'll talk about more in Unit 4, indentured servitude, more in Unit 4. But we do kind of see the decline of serfdom. And yet, with the decline of serfdom, it's no longer simply a conflict between serfs and nobles, but we do kind of see that the introduction of this new class, the bourgeoisie, there will be tensions between them and also with everybody, really, because nobles don't want to give up power from these new upstarts, these middle class people. So there's some tension there. But there's also tension between the lower classes, between the urban workers and peasant workers against the new bourgeoisie. So peasant rebellions are very common during this time. An example is the German Peasants' War, for example. But we also do see urbanization during this time as a result of increased trade. Well, Europe is going to have access to a whole lot new food sources, not just in the Indian Ocean, but especially with the New World. New crops from the New World, like corn and potatoes, they're going to become staple products or staple crops for farmers in Western Europe, especially. And that's going to lead to more people. So, generally, more food, more people, more cities. In terms of other changes, let's look at gender. Let's look at the family. So we are going to see that we will have changes in gender and family roles during the early modern period for a variety of reasons. For one thing, we are going to see kind of the religious explanation for family structures develop. And we mostly see that the Protestant Reformation is going to introduce a a concept in world history called the nuclear family. And essentially, a nuclear family is this image right here. It's the dad, it's the mom, and the kids. That's it. None of this extended family like cousins and aunts and uncles living in the same household. No, it's just the nuclear family, just the father, the dad, the mom, and the kids. But the Protestant Reformation is kind of going to introduce this concept of the nuclear family because of that insistence of reading what is directly in the Bible. And the Bible is full of patriarchs, of guys like Abraham, who lived with his wife, Sarah, I think is her name, and her kids, Isaac, and the Muslim one, Ishmael. Yeah, is that his name? Yeah, I think that's his name. Anyway, so the Protestant Reformation is literally going to argue that women, their role in the nuclear family is to educate and take care of the children. The children need to be taken care of by the mom. And that's a big kind of new concept, actually, because for much of European history, women worked alongside men. Not necessarily in the fields, perhaps, but in doing things at home for the good of the community. However, there is going to be this idea, especially in Protestant countries, that women, their only purpose in life is to make babies and to care for those babies and to look pretty, I guess. But we also see that the other major intellectual movement towards the end of this period, the Enlightenment, is also going to kind of change gender, or family roles. We do kind of see that the Enlightenment and its idea of we need to improve society is going to translate to we need to educate our children. We can improve society by educating our children and by recognizing that they are children, for one thing. So there is going to be kind of this idea that we need to formally educate children. And yet again, we are going to see that this is largely limited to rich families. Rich families have the means to educate their children, to send them to universities, to hire private tutors. Most common people don't have the means to educate themselves. There's no public schooling. There's just school for rich people. And then finally, we are also seeing a decrease in family sizes during this time. And that's mostly because with the rise of capitalism, that will lead to people needing to buy things. And people who sell food, they can charge whatever price they want. So with higher bread prices, especially, we are going to see a lot of class conflict. And that's going to actually translate to people feeling kind of a pinch in their wallets. That's going to mean we need to have less kids. So you should be able to identify social and economic changes in Europe and what are some causes and results of these changes. All right, let's look at politics. That's the main kind of focus of this unit. So we are going to focus on two intellectual, or I should say political philosophies as it relates to government during the early modern period. The first is absolutism. The second is constitutionalism. And we're going to look at the difference between those two in just a second. But first, what is one of these political theories? And it's going to be a very popular one that will be experienced not just in Europe, but as we're going to see later on in the Islamic world and in Eastern Europe as well. And that theory is absolutism. Well, in general, kind of before we even define what absolutism is, it is important to understand that governments generally are gaining more centralized power during this time, both absolutist ones and constitutionalist ones. But what is absolutism? Well, absolutism is the theory, the political theory that a monarchy should retain absolute or complete control over varying systems in their society. So all power should be invested in the king, and it's mostly going to be kings, the monarchs of Europe. So we are going to see that absolutism will be a political theory that will be developed and expanded on, especially in places like France, in Spain, in places like Russia, as we'll talk about later, in Austria, in the Holy Roman Empire to a degree. It says England here, and we'll kind of talk about that in just a second, how that's a little bit true, but also not true at the same time. So don't pay attention to that. In fact, kaboom. Haha. Anyway. All right, so what are some characteristics of absolutism? And this will help define what it is a little bit more. So what is absolutism? What are some characteristics of it? Well, let's first look at some causes before we look at the characteristics. Well, in general, some causes include the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation is going to impact absolutism two ways. For one thing, it's going to say that the Catholic Church has less political power, that's for certain. And where does that political power end up? It's going to end up in the hands of secular leaders. But we also see that the various conflicts during the Reformation, especially these wars of religion, they are going to lead to centralization. In general, kind of times of war lead to stronger, more centralized governments. We saw by the end of Unit 2 the decline of feudalism. That will also kind of lead to more centralization. But we also do see that there are new philosophies to justify absolutism. So we're going to look at two philosophers that are going to absolutely support absolutism. For one of them is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who's going to make the argument that we need a strong government because basically humans are bad. And if humans have the ability to basically do whatever they want without a government to supervise them, well, then we'd absolutely end up in chaos. So Hobbes is going to argue that we need a strong government to enforce a protected society, a secure and safe society. It's very similar, you could say, to legalism. Whoa! All right. What's another absolutist theorist? Well, another one is this guy, this French priest named Jacques Bousset. And Bousset is going to make the argument that kings have the right by God to rule over society. And of course, we've encountered this theory before. It's divine right. So there's a continuity, I guess, in European history, is the idea of divine right. So I mentioned before that there are characteristics of absolutism. There are 7 in particular. And this is true not just for Europe, but for the Middle East as well, for Islamic world as well. So let's look at some characteristics of absolutism. Well, for one thing, In any absolutist system, we are going to have a very powerful ruling family, a very powerful dynasty. For another thing, we are going to see that these really powerful ruling dynasties will take away the power from the nobility. We see that in a variety of different ways. For one thing, absolute monarchs believe that they are literally appointed by God to rule over society, and therefore, anybody that challenges that is challenging God's directive. So we are going to see that kind of in order to maintain this absolute power, that monarchs are going to keep a watchful eye over their nobles. And they do that largely by kind of having elaborate ceremonies that involve the nobility. They will give out titles to nobles who are loyal to them. And they are also going to, in some cases, keep them at their palaces as well, to keep a literal eye on them, to prevent the nobles from making their own armies. We also see that absolute monarchs will justify their rule using art, using very elaborate art, especially using kind of really big palaces, as we will see in a second. And also we do see that kind of the use of very elaborate ceremonies involving noble participation. This is another way to show power over people. We see that absolute monarchs are going to enforce absolute religious conformity. Everyone in their country has to follow their beliefs. So we will kind of see a reversal of religious tolerance that was actually gained as a result of many of these wars of religion. We also see that these absolute monarchs will justify their power by expanding their territory, by controlling trade in their country through mercantilism. We see the use of professionalized armies that are not raised by the nobles, but by the monarchs themselves. And of course, to pay for all of this, you need a better bureaucracy. You need more taxation. You need censorship to ensure your absolute authority. So again, these are the 7 characteristics of absolutism. You should be familiar with them, and they especially answer today's lesson objective. So let's look at some examples in Europe. The first and probably best is France, actually. And we're going to look particularly at the rule of this guy in the picture, Louis XIV. Louis XIV belongs to the Bourbon dynasty, so a powerful ruling dynasty. And Louis XIV is a very notable figure because he is one of the longest ruling monarchs in world history. I believe he's either the first or second. I can't remember. He's either before Elizabeth II, the one that died recently, or after her. I can't remember. But Louis XIV is the prime example of an absolute monarch. And in fact, other absolute monarchs are going to kind of copy what he does. So that's why he's the best example for all of this. He's also the best example, in my opinion, because he's got like literally every portrait that he's in, he has like really long exposed leg, like just one single one. I call him Mr. Sexy Legs personally. Anyway. How is he an example of an absolute monarch? Well, Louis XIV is actually going to be a prime example because he is going to take significant power away from the nobility, especially by basically destroying the Estates General. And remember, the Estates General was an institution developed in the Middle Ages that essentially was a body that was made to make sure that the king consulted with the different classes of France before he passed any new taxes. And essentially what Louis XIV does is saying, well, I'm going to build a lot of stuff. I'm not going to raise taxes. Therefore, I don't need to consult the Estates General. He's basically going to disband the Estates General, and it's not going to exist in France until the end of the 1700s, and we'll talk about that more later with the French Revolution, but he's going to stop the Estates General to basically get more power for himself. He's going to ensure religious conformity in France by revoking religious tolerance. Remember, religious tolerance was gained through the Edict of Nantes. Well, Louis XIV is going to say no to that, and he's going to say in the Edict of Fontainebleau that basically everyone has to be Catholic. And Louis XIV is also going to be an example of how rulers use elaborate art to solidify and legitimize their power, because he's going to build a really big palace called Versailles. And Versailles, as we'll see in a second, is this huge palace complex. And it's a palace complex where everybody wants to be. And they want to be there not just because of all the parties that Louis XIV throws, but because Louis XIV will literally require it. He is going to require that nobles live in his palace of Versailles so he can keep an eye on them, so they're not in their kind of provinces raising armies to challenge him. And we do see that nobles will kind of curry favor, literally, with Louis XIV in order to secure their nobility, their position. We will see that nobles will literally do anything to gain favor with Louis XIV. They will serve him breakfast. They will literally wake up before he does just to watch him wake up. It's ridiculous, this man. He's also going to expand France overseas and in Europe. He's going to raise a really big army that is going to challenge a lot of people in France. It's going to cost a lot of money, unfortunately, as we'll see later. He's going to practice mercantilism. So Louis XIV is a prime example of an absolute monarch. He is gaining his power through all of those characteristics I just described. So this is what Versailles looks like from a bird's eye view. It's a huge, huge palace complex. This is where he lives. This is where all the nobles live. And look at all these gardens everywhere. Absolutely ridiculous how big Versailles is. All these nobles lining up just to win favor with King Louis XIV. This is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And by the way, Louis XIV is not the guy who's going to get his head chopped off. That is his great-grandson. Yes, I said that right. That's how long Louis XIV rules. He rules so long, his son has to be skipped for the succession. And then this is a video that I would have showed in class, basically showing Louis XIV waking up and all the nobles like lining up to say hi to him. Well, let's not watch it. Other examples include the Habsburg family. And who are the Habsburgs? Well, essentially, they're the reason why you don't marry your cousin, as we'll see in a second. The Habsburgs, they are a powerful ruling family in the Holy Roman Empire. And as we probably discussed in Unit 1, the Holy Roman Empire was a very decentralized state. I mean, literally, there were like 300 different countries within the Holy Roman Empire. It was only loosely connected through a figure known as the Emperor. However, during the early modern period, we are going to see that the Habsburgs will try to centralize their power. They're going to fail, but they are going to succeed in other places. They aren't going to centralize power within the Holy Roman Empire, but they are going to enter in the nobility of different countries and centralize power there. The prime example of the kind of monarch that attempted to consolidate his power is Charles V right here. Charles V has a very big chin. All the Habsburgs do, as we'll see in a second. But Charles V is going to try and centralize his power by basically going to war with all of his rivals, with the Ottomans. And the Ottomans do reach as far as the Habsburg holdings in Austria. He is also going to go to war with France to kind of gain more political power. However, he is going to largely fail because there is going to be a successful movement by nobles during the Protestant Reformation to break away from having to listen to the church. And that is something that is actually very much supported by Charles V. Charles V tried to maintain religious conformity, but because of different wars, like the 30 Years' War that will happen later after Charles V, we are going to see that his efforts to ensure conformity do fail. But where he does succeed is that he's going to marry his children into key strategic marriages across Europe. We are going to see that the Habsburg monarchs, they are going to actually find places in all the ruling families, almost all of them, I should say, in Europe, in Spain, in Austria, in the Netherlands for a brief period of time. And one place where the absolute monarchs, the Habsburgs, will succeed is Spain, because Spain is going to be a very successful overseas colonizer, as we'll see later on in Unit 4. They're going to be the top dog of Europe until the 1700s when England replaces them. And Spain, kind of a continuity with them, is that they're going to still use the Inquisition to maintain that Catholic conformity. However, the Habsburgs were a bit too into marrying into royal families because eventually there were literally no other nobles to marry into other than themselves. So we are going to see a lot of the Habsburgs. They're going to marry their cousins, and in some cases step siblings, and in some cases the actual siblings, and it's going to lead to basically people that can't really kind of function because of the kind of immense amount of inbreeding going on. All of the Habsburgs have really big chins because they just kept marrying each other. So moral of the story is don't marry your cousin, don't marry your niece either. That's also really weird. So what are some characteristics of absolutism? What are some examples? All right, the other big theory, and this is going to be the last one for today, is constitutionalism. So what is constitutionalism? Well, it's the idea that government's power derives from a constitution, from a set of laws that are agreed on by the population of a country. So we do kind of see constitutionalism more in places like England and the Netherlands. These are places with a stronger merchant presence. That's just something that you should accept in world history, that places like England and the Netherlands, mostly because they're Protestant countries, because they have that very strong Protestant work ethic, that's where we are going to see capitalism and this merchant class develop the most, and that's also where we will see constitutionalism develop the most. But another big theory of constitutionalism is the idea of the social contract, essentially that government has a responsibility and a obligation to represent the interest of their citizens. So there is kind of a contract that government has to respect the rights of its citizens, and that in exchange, citizens support the government. But if the government, say, were to not support those natural rights, then people were entitled to revolution, as we'll talk about more in Unit 5. There are some philosophers who support this theory of constitutionalism. One of them is John Locke. John Locke is going to have this idea that government has to respect three things. Life, they can't take away someone's life without due process. They can't take away someone's freedom without due process. And they can't take away someone's property without due process. And there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is a French theorist who is not very popular with the French monarchy, but is very popular with people who hate the French monarchy, is Rousseau. Rousseau is going to develop the theory that government's ruled based on the consent of the governed, the consent, the willing participation of everyday people, or I should say citizens. Not everybody, because Rousseau doesn't believe women or black people should participate in government, but at least men. And the final kind of theorist that supports constitutionalists is this Scottish nerd, Adam Smith. Adam Smith is going to say that private property is a right that government should respect, but also that government should open up the markets so that they run by themselves without government interference. We'll talk about Adam Smith more in Unit 5, but he's an example of an Enlightenment philosopher who supports constitutionalism. All right, so there are two big examples of constitutionalist governments. We've got the Netherlands. The Netherlands was primarily a merchant republic, so a republic made up of merchants. There are some nobles, but for the most part, they have elected positions. So anyone who is a man, anyone who owns property, is allowed to vote in these elections. So there is kind of a sense of republicanism in the Netherlands. We see that the Dutch government, they support kind of economic institutions. For example, the Dutch East India Company, very much it represents the interests of merchants. Merchants want government support for their overseas expansion. And we really see that the Dutch will kind of make a huge trading presence around the world. You can see that in this map right here. The Dutch will have colonies in North America, very briefly. They'll have colonies in the Caribbean and in South America. They'll have colonies in Africa and in the Indian Ocean. And we actually do see a brief period in world history where the Dutch will be the dominant European trading power. They'll be the dominant trading power in the Indian Ocean, especially, and in the Atlantic trade system. They're also heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade, unfortunately. So we do kind of see that these governments, they don't really care the morality of all this making money. The other example of constitutionalism in Europe is actually England. And England is not a republic, but rather a parliamentary monarchy. There was kind of brief attempts at absolutism by the various English kings, even going back to, say, Elizabeth I, but for the most part, absolutism won't take hold in England. One kind of notable example how it won't take hold is going to be the reaction against the absolute monarch of Charles I. Charles I is going to suspend Parliament, much like Louis XIV did, but unlike Louis XIV, Charles is actually going to be very challenged because of, he's going to be challenged by those who supported Parliament. So we do kind of see that there will be this conflict in England called the English Civil War. Basically, it's between the monarchy and the Parliament. Parliament, made up of nobles and middle-class people, they're going to go to war with Charles I, and we do see that the absolute monarchy will fail, that Parliament's going to win in the English Civil War. Eventually, kind of another absolutist monarch, James II, comes to power, but he's going to be deposed in the Glorious Revolution, in which two new monarchs come to power, William and Mary, and in exchange for accepting this kingly position, both William and Mary agree, okay, we can rule with Parliament. We will have a parliamentary monarchy, a monarchy in which there is shared power between the Parliament and the king. That the king approves of laws that the Parliament passes, basically. So the king has to consult with Parliament, basically. That's kind of something that is going on in England. And the Parliament is made up not just of nobles in the House of Lords, but it's also made up of those members of the bourgeoisie, those members of the merchant middle class. Also in England, there is something known as the English Bill of Rights. Essentially, it is a list of rights. It's an expansion of the Magna Carta. It's a list of rights that all Englishmen have, and that these rights come from the consent of the people, and the representation of the consent of the people is elections in Parliament. Only rich people can vote, only property owners can vote, but heck, that is more than other places, I guess. So this English Bill of Rights is going to say that people have natural rights. It's going to be an inspiration for future documents that we'll talk about more in the future. So you should be able to define constitutionalism, and you should also be able to answer this question of how do constitutional societies gain support or legitimacy from everyday people? Finally, this is where we'll conclude. What are some results of centralization? Well, for one thing, we're going to have a lot more warfare. These professionalized armies used by these absolute monarchs and these more centralized constitutional governments, that's going to lead to competition for territory around the world. We are going to see the use of professionalized militaries leading to the decline of the nobility's power. But we also do see that in order to kind of secure political power, that we do have a system of complex alliances forming in Europe that often change, but they do exist nonetheless. And we call this series of alliance building the diplomatic revolution going on in this time period. And yet centralization is not without its problems. For one thing, centralization costs a lot of money. I mean, you saw Versailles. That cost a lot of money. However, despite the fact it costing a lot of money, guess who doesn't have to pay taxes? The nobility. And guess who does have to pay taxes? The middle class, the bourgeoisie. But on top of that, absolute monarchs can just take rights away willy-nilly, especially that right to property. And we're going to see how that causes problems later on in Unit 5. And that's going to be one of the big causes of, say, the French Revolution, and to a lesser extent, the American Revolution. So you should be able to kind of identify the results of the rise of more centralized governments in Europe. All right, that's it for today. It's a bit of a longer one, but it's an important one. Have a great day. I'll post pictures of Louis XIV's sexy legs later on. Have a great day. Bye.